Margaret Hale sat stiff in the wagon as it rattled along the rutted road, her gloved hands folded tight around a letter that had already been read near to ruin. The paper was soft where her fingers had pressed it over and over, the ink blurred but still clear enough to hold its promise. Samuel Carter, rancher of Dust Creek, had written in a hand both strong and plain. He had not offered sweet words, nor poetry, only a bargain written straight. A wife in exchange for work, steadiness, and a share in the keeping of his land. For a woman with little left, it was enough. The horizon stretched wide and lonely, the prairie rolling out beneath a sky so big it swallowed her breath. She pulled her shawl closer against the spring wind, though the sun burned warm on her shoulders. The driver hummed low as he guided the team, the wheels thudding over stones and kicking dust into the air. Margaret kept her eyes forward, watching the line of hills that marked the edge of Dust Creek country. Each mile carried her further from the small town back east, where she had buried her husband, further from the narrow room above the mill where she had sewn until her hands ached, further from the quiet pity of neighbors who saw only a widow with nothing to her name. The letter in her lap had lit a spark she had not known she still carried. She read its lines in her head, the blunt honesty of them steadying her as much as they unsettled her. "The ranch is failing," it said. "I cannot keep it alone. I seek a wife who is not afraid of work. If you have the will, then come, Samuel Carter." It was not romance he offered, but a chance, and Margaret had chosen to take it. Still, doubt whispered as the road wound toward Dust Creek. What if the ranch was worse than he claimed? What if Samuel Carter was a cruel man? What if she was nothing more than another mouth to feed, in a place already sinking? She gripped the paper tighter, pressing the folded edge into her palm as if the pain of it might chase the fear away. The wagon rolled past scattered cabins, smoke rising from their chimneys, children pausing in their play to stare as she passed. Dust Creek itself appeared at last, no more than a handful of buildings huddled against the plain, their signs swinging in the wind. Beyond it stretched open land, fences leaning, fields bare, and barns standing like weary sentinels. Somewhere in that distance waited Samuel Carter, the man who had written a letter instead of letting his land go to ruin. Margaret lifted her chin, her back straight against the bumps of the road. She had buried her past, she had survived loss and hunger. She had carried herself this far alone. Whatever waited in Dust Creek, she would meet it with the same stubborn will that had brought her here. She folded the letter once more and tucked it close to her heart, whispering a quiet prayer into the wind, not for luck, but for the strength to build something from the ashes of what had been lost. The wagon jolted to a stop at the edge of the Carter place, and Margaret's first sight of it stole the breath from her chest. The fences leaned, as if one more storm might topple them. The fields lay wild with weeds that reached up in thick patches, and the barn sagged to one side where half its roof had already caved in. What should have looked like a working ranch appeared more like a ruin, left to the mercy of wind and sun. She tightened her grip on the carpetbag in her lap, forcing herself to lift her chin as if she had expected nothing else. The driver gave a low whistle. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked, but Margaret only nodded. She stepped down onto the packed dirt, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, and faced the house. The paint had long since peeled away, the shutters hanging uneven, yet the porch boards were swept clean, a sign that someone still cared enough to keep order where they could. A tall man stepped out onto that porch, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. He wore plain work clothes, the knees worn thin, the sleeves rolled back on arms darkened by the sun. His shoulders were broad, his stance firm, but his face carried lines too deep for his years. His eyes met hers with steady weight, shadowed as if they had seen too much, and chosen silence over story. "You are Margaret Hale," he said, his voice low and even. "I am," she answered, drawing herself up though her heart thudded with nerves. He studied her a long moment before nodding once. "I am Samuel Carter. I reckon you read my letter clear enough. This is the place, such as it is." Margaret looked again at the sagging barn and the wild field, then back at him. "It is not what I pictured," she admitted softly, though she kept her tone firm. He gave the faintest shrug. "I did not dress it up for you." The ranch is near gone. The bank will take it if I cannot turn it. A man cannot run it alone. Not anymore. His bluntness cut through the wind, and Margaret found herself both stung and steadied by it. There was no false kindness in him, no pretense of romance, only a plain bargain offered, as sharp and real as the land itself. He stepped down from the porch, close enough that she could see the gray in his dark hair, the weariness in his eyes. "I will not promise ease," he said. "I can only promise work and a place, if you want it. You will be wife in name and partner in labor. Nothing more unless you choose it." Margaret's throat tightened, but she met his gaze without flinching. "I have known hard work," she said. "I do not shrink from it." For a moment his eyes searched hers, as though weighing the truth of her words. Then he nodded again, the smallest spark of something unreadable flickering behind his sternness. "Supper will be simple," he said. "Bread and beans. You can settle your things inside." She followed him toward the house, the bag heavy in her hand, her heart heavier still, yet somewhere deep beneath the weight stirred the faintest spark of resolve. She had come west for a chance, and here it stood before her, worn and silent, yet alive enough to fight for. The kitchen smelled faintly of smoke and boiled beans, the kind of scent that clung to the walls of a house long past its best days. Margaret sat at the rough-hewn table with her carpet bag by her feet, her gloves folded neatly in her lap. The boards beneath her chair creaked with every shift, and she felt the weight of the silence pressing in on her. Samuel moved with slow efficiency, setting a pot on the table and cutting a heel of bread that was hard enough to scrape the knife. He poured the beans into 2 bowls, his face unreadable as he slid one toward her. It was not a meal meant to impress, and Margaret understood at once that he had no intention of courting her with charm. He sat down opposite her, elbows resting on the table, and ate without a word. Margaret followed his lead. Though each bite of the bread made her jaw ache, she forced herself to chew and swallow, keeping her back straight, her gaze fixed on the man who had summoned her here with a letter written in blunt lines. When the bowls were half empty, he set his spoon aside and leaned back. His eyes met hers across the table, shadowed by something more than weariness. "I lost my wife 6 years ago," he said simply, as if naming a fact rather than a wound. "She gave me this place, kept it alive while I was gone. The war took her brother. Then it took most of the hands I could trust. When I came back, there was less of the ranch and less of me." Margaret's hands tightened on her lap, her heart thudding at the raw honesty in his tone. He did not look away, did not soften his words with apology. "The bank waits like a wolf," he went on. "I need help to keep it from being taken. I cannot pay a woman, but I can offer a place here. Food enough if the land gives, a roof though it leaks, and my name though it does not hold much anymore." He fell silent then, and the room filled with the crackle of the low fire. Margaret drew in a slow breath, her mind circling the truth she had carried since boarding the wagon east of here. She had no home to return to, no family willing to take her in, no work waiting beyond scraps that barely fed her. She could turn away from this bargain, but there was nothing behind her but emptiness. Her eyes lifted to Samuel's face, and she saw not cruelty there, but the blunt steadiness of a man who had endured more than his share of loss. "I will stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I will not be only a name on a paper. If I am to be here, I will be more than that." For the first time his gaze shifted, something flickering across his features. Not quite surprise, not quite relief. He gave a slow nod, his hands folding together on the table. "Then we understand each other," he said. Margaret reached for her bowl again, the beans gone cool, her decision warming her more than the food ever could. She had struck her bargain, yet in her heart she vowed it would become something stronger, something built not on debt alone, but on the stubborn will to live and to belong. Morning came early on the Carter Ranch, the pale light sliding through cracked shutters and stirring the dust that never seemed to leave the air. Margaret rose before the rooster crowed, tying her hair back with quick fingers, pulling on the work dress she had patched twice already. The stove took coaxing to light, the wood damp from last night's rain, but she set the fire steady, and cooked what little there was, bread fried in lard, and weak coffee stretched thin. Samuel came in from the yard as she laid the meal on the table, his boots leaving trails of mud across the floor. He nodded once in thanks but spoke no more, eating with the same silence that had followed her since the night she agreed to stay. The days fell into rhythm, though not an easy one. Margaret washed and mended, her hands raw from lye soap, then pulled weeds from the garden that had been left to choke itself near dry. She helped mend fences, though her palms blistered on the hammer handle, and dragged water from the well until her arms shook. Samuel worked alongside her, when the chores demanded it, but he never lingered near. He gave curt directions, short words that told her what needed doing, then carried on as if she were no more than another hired hand. His silence weighed heavier than the broken boards or the sagging barn, and yet Margaret found herself studying him when he thought no one watched. In town, the whispers rose quick enough. At the general store, she overheard two women talking near the sugar barrel. "Poor thing," one said, tying herself to Carter of all men. "He is ruined, and he will ruin her too." The other shook her head, pity plain on her face. "She is a widow already. Maybe she thinks ruin feels the same as loss." Margaret kept her face steady, her chin high, but the words stung deep. She paid for her flour and lamp oil, carried the sacks herself to the wagon, and told herself that no one in town had the right to measure her worth. Back on the ranch, the wind carried a different kind of truth. She began to notice small things in Samuel that others did not see. He fixed the hinge on the back door without a word, after watching her struggle with it. When she burned her hand on the stove, he brought a jar of salve from the barn, setting it by her side without comment. At night, when he thought she had gone to bed, she saw him walk the fence line in the dark, as if making sure the land still knew he had not given up. These sparks did not change the hardness of his face or the distance in his voice, but Margaret felt them all the same. They lit a small hope inside her, one she dared not speak aloud. The days were long, the labor rough, and the silence near unbearable. Yet in the cracks of that silence she sensed something more. It was faint as an ember buried in ash, but it was enough to keep her steady when the gossip pressed close and the work pressed harder. The afternoon sun fell heavy across the yard, and Margaret carried the wash in from the line, her arms aching from wringing water out of shirts stiff with dust and work. Inside the house, the air was cooler, shadows stretching long across the floor. She moved through the rooms with the basket on her hip, setting clothes in their places, folding with the same neatness her mother once taught her. When she came to the narrow hallway that led to the bedroom Samuel never entered, she paused. The door was not fully shut, and for the first time, she noticed a small trunk at the foot of the bed, its brass hinges dulled with age, a lock fixed tight across the front. Something about the trunk called to her, not curiosity alone, but the quiet sense that it held the reason for the silence that seemed to hang over Samuel like a shroud. She set the basket down and knelt before it, her hand brushing dust from the lid. The wood was scratched, worn smooth in places where someone had once touched it often. Margaret reached for the lock, her fingers lingering there, though she did not try to force it. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the memory of someone she had never known. The floorboard behind her creaked. She turned and found Samuel in the doorway, his shadow filling the frame, his face hard as stone. His eyes fixed on her hand at the lock, and the anger in them rose quick and sharp. "That is not yours," he said, his voice rough, tighter than she had ever heard it. Margaret stood slowly, brushing her skirt, but she did not step away. "I was not prying," she said softly. "I only saw it there." His fists curled at his sides, his jaw set so firm she thought his teeth might break. "Those are her things," he said. The words clipped. "They are not for you, not for anyone." The room seemed to close around them, the weight of his grief pressing against her chest. Margaret steadied herself, lifting her chin though her heart beat quick. "I do not wish to take her place, Samuel," she said, her voice low but steady. "I could never do that, and I would never try." His eyes flickered then, a crack in the fury, but he did not speak. She took a slow step closer, careful not to crowd him. "I am not here to erase what you had." I am here to help you carry what remains, to build something new, not on her ashes, but on the ground that is still beneath your feet." For the first time, he did not turn away. He stood rooted in the doorway, his chest rising and falling, his eyes dark with a sorrow so deep she felt it in her own bones. The silence between them shifted, no longer sharp with anger, but heavy with something that wanted to be heard. Margaret waited, letting the quiet speak for him, her hands folded before her. At last his shoulders eased, the hard line of his jaw loosening. He did not thank her, he did not apologize, but he stayed, and that was more than he had ever allowed before. The days stretched long as spring deepened into summer, the kind of days when the sun lingered heavy, and the air smelled of earth warming beneath its touch. Margaret tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and pulled on gloves already worn thin, her hands rough from work yet eager to do more. The garden behind the house had been left to wild weeds that reached her waist, their roots tangled deep in soil that had once given food but now lay nearly choked. She set to it with a hoe, sweat running down her back as she pulled and cut, her muscles burning but her spirit stubborn. Slowly, patches of dark earth began to show, rich and waiting. Out in the field, Samuel worked the fences, his figure tall against the horizon, shoulders steady as he lifted posts and hammered them firm. She could hear the sharp ring of metal against wood, the rhythm of a man who knew his land well even if sorrow had made him turn from it. Sometimes she caught him looking her way, but his eyes always shifted back to his task before she could hold his gaze. Still, the work itself drew them into the same rhythm, a kind of unspoken partnership that neither had claimed but both felt in their bones. Neighbors passing along the road began to notice. Men tipped their hats, women whispered behind gloved hands. "Perhaps Carter is not finished after all," they said. Margaret pretended not to hear, but inside she carried a small pride that grew with every green shoot pushing through the soil, every fence that stood firm against the wind. One morning Samuel came to the garden, where she knelt among neat rows of sprouting beans. His boots sank into the damp earth as he stood over her, his shadow cutting across the plants. "You should see the plow," he said, his voice plain as always. She rose, brushing dirt from her skirt, and followed him to the shed where the plow stood waiting, its iron dull but strong. He showed her how to grip the handles, his large hands closing over hers to guide the weight. The soil turned beneath their steps, heavy and rich, the air filling with the smell of fresh earth. Margaret's arms strained, her breath quickened, yet she felt steadied by his nearness, the brush of his calloused fingers against her own. For a moment the silence between them softened, no longer sharp, but something that hummed low and warm. When the row was finished, she leaned on the handle, laughing a little at the ache in her arms. Samuel looked at her then, not with pity, but with a quiet spark she had not seen before. "You did well," he said, the words few but heavy with meaning. She smiled, brushing the sweat from her brow, and felt her heart stir in a way it had not for years. The land was changing beneath their hands, and so were they. What had begun as ruin was slowly turning to life again, not just in the soil, but in the space that stretched between a woman who had nothing left and a man who thought he had lost it all. The knock came sharp against the wooden door, hard enough to rattle the loose pane of glass in the frame. Margaret looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, her arms dusted white with flour, and saw Samuel stiffen where he sat by the fire mending tack. His shoulders tensed as if the sound had struck him, and for a long moment he did not move. Then he set the leather aside and rose, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he crossed to the door. When he opened it, two men stood on the porch. One wore the badge of the sheriff, his hat tilted low, his expression caught between duty and pity. The other was dressed in a neat coat, despite the dust of the trail, a collector from the bank whose eyes measured the house and the land beyond as if they already belonged to him. Samuel did not greet them. He only braced one hand against the frame, blocking the way. "Carter," the collector said, his voice smooth and cold, "the note is past due. The bank cannot wait forever." Samuel's jaw tightened, his voice flat. "I told you I will have it by harvest." The man shook his head. "Harvest will not come soon enough. You pay what is owed, or the land is taken." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. but he did not speak. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward before she could think better of it. She moved to Samuel's side, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed steady on the men at the door. "This house is not leaving his hands," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We are working the land. The crops are planted, and they will come. You will have your payment, but you will wait." The collector's brows rose at her words. "And who are you, madam, to speak on the matter?" Samuel turned sharply toward her, but Margaret did not falter. "I am his wife," she said, "and I stand with him. If the bank takes this land, they take it from me too." The sheriff cleared his throat, his gaze flicking between them. "She means what she says," he muttered. "Best to give them the time." The collector frowned, but after a tense silence, he tipped his hat and turned away, the sheriff following close behind. Their figures faded down the dusty road, until only the quiet hum of crickets filled the air. Samuel shut the door hard, his breath tight in his chest. He looked at her then, his eyes dark with something sharper than anger. "You should not have spoken," he said, his voice rough. "This is my fight." Margaret met his gaze unflinching. "Then it is mine too," she answered. "I will not stand aside while men tear this house down around you." He stared at her, as if searching for the weakness he expected, but all he found was resolve. His hands flexed at his sides. His mouth worked as though words fought to come free. At last, long after the silence had thickened, he spoke low, almost broken. "I cannot do this without you." The words hung in the air, bare and raw. Margaret's heart ached at them, yet warmth spread through her chest all the same. She reached for his hand, rough and calloused, and held it tight. "Together," she whispered. For the first time, Samuel did not pull away. The storm rolled in, fierce and sudden. Clouds black as coal piling over the hills, the air thick with the smell of rain and the charge of lightning. Margaret had just finished shutting the shutters when the first crack split the sky, the sound rattling the walls of the house. Samuel was already in his boots, pulling on his coat, muttering that he needed to check the stock. She followed him to the porch, the wind tearing at her skirts, the rain stinging her cheeks. In the distance a glow rose against the dark sky, sharp and terrible, and her stomach dropped. "The barn!" she gasped, her voice nearly lost to the roar of thunder. They ran together across the yard, the mud sucking at their boots, water streaming in sheets around them. The barn doors were half open, flames licking the rafters inside, smoke pouring out in choking waves. "The lantern must have tipped," Samuel shouted, though his voice was rough and broken by coughs. Horses screamed in their stalls, kicking against the walls, panic rising as fast as the fire. Without hesitation, Margaret plunged inside, her shawl pulled tight over her nose, her eyes watering from the smoke. Samuel cursed behind her, then followed, his broad frame forcing open the stalls while she pulled at the ropes with blistering hands. A mare bolted past them, nearly knocking Margaret down, but Samuel caught her arm and pulled her back to her feet. Together they moved from stall to stall, shouting, pushing, driving the animals toward the open yard. Sparks rained down from above, burning holes through her sleeves, the heat searing her skin. By the time the last horse burst free, the barn groaned like a dying beast, the roof beginning to sag. Margaret grabbed a bucket near the trough, heaving water at the flames along the wall. Samuel joined her, the two of them working side by side, their bodies soaked with rain and sweat, their arms trembling with exhaustion. They fought until their muscles screamed, until the fire shrank to embers, and the storm itself beat down what little remained. When at last it was over, Margaret staggered into the yard, her breath coming ragged, her palms raw and red. She fell to her knees in the mud, the rain washing soot from her face. Samuel was there in an instant, crouching beside her, his own chest heaving. "Let me see," he said, his voice low, urgent. He reached for her hands, turning them gently in his rough ones. The skin was blistered, angry from the heat, and she winced at his touch. His fingers shook as he cradled hers, holding them as though they might break apart in his grasp. "You are burned," he whispered, his voice thick with something more than fear. "You could have been lost in there." "I am here," she said softly, though her throat stung with smoke. "We saved them, Samuel." He looked at her then, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes dark with all the words he had never spoken. His hand still trembled as he wrapped her palms in the cloth pulled from his coat, his thumb lingering against her wrist. For the first time, his silence did not feel like distance, but like a confession, his fear laid bare in the way he held her. And in that moment, Margaret knew the fire had done more than test their bodies. It had burned through the last of the walls he had built, leaving behind the raw truth of how much he could not bear to lose her. The next evening the house felt different, though Margaret could not at first say why. She stepped in from the yard, with her skirts damp from the dew, the smell of earth still clinging to her hands. The kitchen met her with a glow she did not expect, the lamp trimmed low, and 2 candles flickering in the center of the table. The surface had been scrubbed clean, every crumb and speck gone, the wood gleaming in the soft light. 2 plates were set out, 2 cups placed side by side, and a loaf of bread still warm rested on a cloth. For a moment she stood in the doorway, her heart beating quick. She had not known him to mark any evening as different from another, yet here was something deliberate, something that made her chest tighten. Samuel entered from the hallway, his hair damp as if he had just washed, his shirt clean though a bit rumpled from his large hands trying to smooth it. He paused when he saw her, shifting his weight as though uncertain how to begin. "I thought we might have a proper supper," he said, his voice steady but carrying a rough edge of nerves. Margaret smiled, a soft curve of her lips that she could not hold back. "Proper seems fitting after the fire," she said. "We came close to losing more than barns and fences." He nodded, pulling out the chair for her, the gesture awkward yet careful. They sat together, eating in silence broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the clink of knives against plates. The food was plain, bread and beans, but somehow it tasted different, touched by the effort he had put into making the evening feel set apart. When the plates were empty, he reached into his pocket, his hand closing around something hidden. His jaw worked as though he were forcing words up from a place unused to giving them voice. At last he stood, his boots scraping the floor, and placed a small object on the table in front of her. It was a ring, carved of wood, the grain smoothed by careful sanding, the edges rounded by patient hands. "I do not have gold," he said, his voice low. "I have little to give, but I made this." Margaret stared at it, her breath catching. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the surface, warm and simple. Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time she saw him unguarded. The walls of silence pulled back to reveal the man who had been there all along. "I am not promising ease," Samuel went on, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I would have you stay, not as bargain or burden, but as my wife in truth." Her eyes blurred with tears she could not hold back. She slid the ring onto her finger, the fit snug and sure, and smiled through the wetness on her cheeks. "I accept," she said, her voice breaking but full. "Not just the ring, Samuel, but this life we are beginning." For a moment, the room held nothing but the sound of the fire, and the quiet rhythm of 2 hearts that had found their way to each other at last. The months slipped by with a steadiness that surprised Margaret, each day carrying its share of labor, yet no longer feeling like a burden she carried alone. The fields that had once been gray with weeds now pushed up rows of green, the garden behind the house thick with beans and squash, the fences straight and firm under the sun. Every corner of the ranch bore the mark of work done by 2 sets of hands instead of 1, and that change showed not just in the land, but in the faces of those who worked it. In the mornings Margaret rose before the roosters crow, her skirts brushing the floorboards as she lit the stove and set coffee to boil. Samuel would be outside already, his boots crunching across the yard as he checked the stock, his silhouette steady in the dawn light. By the time he came in, the table was laid, and they shared their first meal of the day in a quiet that no longer felt sharp but companionable. Sometimes she would tell him of a dream she had, or he would mention a memory of the land when it had been young and strong, and the words flowed easier than they once had. Eliza's laughter often rang through the yard when neighbor children came to play, and though she was not Samuel's by blood, Margaret felt a warm pride when the girl ran to her with a scraped knee or a story to tell. Samuel watched these moments with a look he rarely voiced, But Margaret caught it all the same, a softening in his eyes that told her he was grateful. By midsummer they made a trip into town, the wagon polished as best as Samuel could manage, Margaret in her blue dress, with a ribbon tied neat in her hair. Folks along the street watched them pass, their whispers no longer full of pity but of surprise and respect. "Carter's place is thriving again," they said. And it was clear to all that the woman at his side had become as much a part of that revival as the man himself. At the photographer's shop, Samuel shifted uncomfortably as they were told to stand still, his broad shoulders stiff against the backdrop. Margaret placed her hand lightly on his arm, steadying him with a smile, and when the shutter clicked, she knew the image had caught more than faces. It had captured the truth of what had grown between them, a bond born of labor and choice, a quiet devotion that had taken root as firmly as the crops in the field. When the photograph was delivered a week later, they hung it above the mantel. Margaret stood before it, her hand resting on Samuel's, both of them looking at the picture in silence. There they were, side by side, not bound by bargain alone but by something far stronger, something that had taken hold slowly and would not let go. And as the fire crackled low in the hearth, Margaret knew she was no longer a guest, no longer a widow searching for place. She was home. The night was quiet enough that Margaret could hear the soft rustle of leaves at the edge of the yard, the crickets singing steady in the grass, and the creak of the porch boards as Samuel shifted his weight against the railing. She had finished her chores long ago, but her heart tugged her to the trunk at the foot of the bed, the one she had carried from her old life into this new one. She lifted the lid and reached beneath her folded shawl until her fingers brushed the brittle paper. The advertisement for a wife, the words simple and blunt, still carried the power of the choice she had made. Her eyes lingered on the faded lines, the promise written by a man she had not known yet trusted enough to ride west to meet. She held it for a long moment, before rising and carrying it through the quiet house. In the kitchen, the wooden box sat on the shelf, the one Samuel kept close, filled with letters he had once written during the war, letters that had carried grief and loss across years of silence. She lifted the lid and slipped the advertisement inside, tucking it among the folded pages, a scrap of her past joining with his, both pieces of sorrow turned to something whole. She closed the box with care, her hand lingering on the lid as if to seal the past in a place where it could rest. When she stepped out onto the porch, the sky stretched wide above, the stars scattered bright and endless. Samuel turned to her, his face lined with the years he had carried, softened now by the light of the lantern at the door. She moved to stand beside him, her hand brushing his until he took it in his own. His grip was steady, his thumb tracing lightly over her knuckles, and for a while they stood in silence, watching the land they had brought back to life. At last he spoke, his voice low and sure. "It was never a bargain, Margaret. It was the start of us." Her chest tightened at the words, tears gathering though she did not let them fall. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and felt the truth of it settle deep. What had begun as a desperate trade, a widow seeking shelter, and a man clinging to the last of his land, had become a marriage built of labor, trust, and quiet love. She thought of the advertisement folded now among his war letters, no longer a mark of need, but a reminder of where they had begun. So here their story rests, not in loss, but in the steady warmth of a home rebuilt, a family stitched together by choice as much as by chance. If you enjoyed walking this journey with them, I invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this story with others who love a good, slow-burn Western romance. And if you ever write your own advertisement for a wife, best make sure you also promise better bread than Samuel's beans.